At 6:58 on a Thursday evening, I was standing in the doorway of a record shop, wondering if I had the wrong address. The sign above me said Second Spin, which sounded either like a bar or a physical therapy clinic, but the website had called it Chicago's coziest listening lounge, and my coworker Renata had said, "You'll love it. Nora, it's small and warm, and they have that wine in cans you like." I did like wine in cans. It required no commitment. I had never been on a blind date before, which felt like something I should mention. Given that I was 37 years old and had spent much of the last decade either engaged to someone or quietly untangling from him. The engagement had ended 26 months ago. I knew the number of months, the way you know the serial number on something you're still not sure you should have returned. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm a developmental editor for an academic press that publishes books no one reads outside of graduate seminars. And I work from my apartment in Logan Square with a cat named Seneca, a standing desk I never stand at, and a brain that describes emotions in passive voice. Things are felt, things are processed, things become clear upon further reflection. Paul had said at the end, "You are the most observant person I've ever met, and somehow you never know what you're feeling." He said it as a kind of eulogy for us. I was still not sure he was wrong. Renata had set this up. Renata was my closest work friend, which meant she had heard 2 years of quiet lunches where I ordered the same salad and said things were fine, just busy with the precise tone of a woman who had stopped expecting follow-up questions. She had apparently gotten tired of it, so she had called her brother. "James is a good man," she'd said. "He teaches chemistry. He makes furniture on weekends. He's very calm." I'd said, "That sounds like a LinkedIn recommendation." She'd said, "Nora, I love you. Please leave your apartment on purpose sometime." The barb landed because it was accurate. So there I was at Second Spin, a narrow room with exposed brick and low amber lighting that smelled like cedar and something faintly citrus. Vinyl sleeves lining the walls in alphabetical order and 4 small tables arranged near a bar that offered 3 beers, 2 wines, and 1 canned rosé I was already planning to order. A speaker near the back played something that sounded like early Bill Withers. 2 couples leaned toward each other over the tables with the soft confidence of people who had already done the hard part. I ordered the rosé. I stood. 7 minutes passed. Then 8. I did what I always do when waiting. I organized the experience into categories. The bartender had a small tattoo of a bracket fungus behind her left ear. The couple nearest me was on a first date because neither of them had stopped asking questions. The record in the display window was Blue by Joni Mitchell, and someone had placed a handwritten card next to it that said, "Still the best." I agreed. I also noted that agreeing with handwritten cards while standing alone and waiting for a stranger was not a good sign regarding your social life. At 7:09, the door opened, and a man walked in holding a backpack that was not his. I knew it wasn't his because it had a small embroidered Iron Man patch on the front pocket, and because the man carrying it was clearly somewhere in his mid to late 30s, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and the careful posture of someone trying very hard not to look like he was in a hurry. He wore a dark green jacket over a gray sweater, and he held the backpack at arm's length, the way you carry something belonging to someone else when you have not yet decided what to do about it. Behind him, barely visible at first, was a teenage boy. Not a small child, not a toddler, a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, in a hoodie with the hood still up and the expression of a person who had recently lost an argument and was not ready to concede. The man scanned the room. When his eyes found mine, something crossed his face. Relief, embarrassment, and a kind of bracing humor, all in about 1 second. He had warm brown eyes and a slight furrow between his brows that looked permanent, the kind you earn by taking things seriously for a long time. "Nora?" he said. Even across the room, his voice had a quality I could not immediately name, something steady in it. "James." He crossed to me. The teenager followed, hood still up, arms crossed. "I'm sorry," James said immediately. "I got a call from Marcus. At 6:45, his bus had broken down. I couldn't." He stopped, started again. "This is Marcus. He's my nephew." "Marcus, this is Nora." Marcus looked at me from under his hood. "My mom set this up," he said. I blinked. "Renata is your mom?" "Yeah." A pause. "She texted me a picture of you." from your work ID badge. It wasn't flattering. James closed his eyes. He looked at me. I didn't ask her to. It's okay. I was trying not to smile. What were the notes? Marcus considered. She said, you seem smart. I said, that's a weird thing to say about a photo. She said, that's what you get from a face. And what do you get? He studied me steadily for a moment. Jury's out. James pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. Marcus, what? She asked. We stood in the narrow entrance. The Bill Withers song ended. Something quieter started piano. No percussion. James looked at me with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite defeat, but somewhere between the two, the look of a man who had been handed an impossible situation and was choosing to remain in it with dignity. I understand if this is, he began. Would Marcus like a Coke? I said. James stopped. I looked at the bar, at the small chalkboard menu, at the teenager now examining the vinyl along the far wall with studied casualness. There's a table by the Coltrane section, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say, but if he's going to be here, he might as well be comfortable. James looked at me for a long moment, then the furrow between his brows loosened, just slightly. Yeah, he said. He'd probably like that. So we sat, Marcus in the corner with a ginger ale and his phone face down, because James asked him to put it face down, without explaining why, which is either good parenting or good instinct, and I wasn't sure there was a difference. James across from me, my canned rosé between us, which Marcus looked at and said, is that wine in a can? And I said, yes, it's efficient. And he said, that's kind of a depressing word for wine. And I said, fair. James smiled into his beer. Renata says you edit books, he said. Academic manuscripts, mostly. The kind with 8-word titles and approximately 4 readers. Do you like it? I paused. Most people assumed I would say yes, because I was clearly the type of person who liked reading. I like making things clearer, I said. Other people's thinking. I'm good at finding what someone means when they can't quite say it. Something shifted in his expression. That sounds useful. In editing, yes. In personal life, it's been called a mixed blessing. He considered that. By whom? He was asking because he wanted to know, not to fill space. My last relationship, I said simply, you? I asked. He turned the beer glass slowly. My family says I'm too patient, that I wait for things to become problems instead of naming them first. Is that true? Probably. He said it without self-pity, just with the equanimity of a man who had held that fact up to the light and decided to keep working on it. I teach high school chemistry. You can't panic in front of 16-year-olds. They sense it. Like horses. Exactly like horses. A pause. Do you know a lot about horses? I know nothing about horses. That sounded right. From the corner, Marcus said, without looking up from the vinyl he was pretending to study. It does sound right. James looked at him with the exasperated fondness of a man who had been closely monitored for a long time. He's been evaluating everything I say since he was 9, James told me. It's a gift. Some days, the conversation found its footing after that. James told me he had started making furniture because he lived alone and couldn't find a bookshelf the right width for his hallway. So he built one, then another. Then a neighbor asked if he could make her a dining table, and he said yes without knowing how, and spent 3 weeks watching YouTube videos at midnight. I said, that's either admirable or insane. He said, the table didn't wobble, so I'm calling it admirable. I told him about the manuscript I was currently editing, a historian's account of civilian rationing in World War I London that had arrived at 90,000 words and would leave as 60,000, because the author had a habit of restating every point in 3 slightly different ways. It's like watching someone refuse to land a plane, I said. James laughed once, unexpected and delighted. The kind of laugh that sounds like it surprised the person it came out of. It was my favorite kind of laugh. Marcus appeared at the table. He held up a record without speaking. Kinda blue. Miles Davis. Uncle James brought me here once, he said, when I was 12. He said, if you can listen to the whole thing without talking, you'll know something about patience. Did you listen without talking? I asked. No, a beat. But I came close. He set the record on the table, then sat in the chair between us and picked up James's beer. Marcus, James said, I'm just smelling it. See what the fuss is about. He set it down. It smells like bad decisions in adulthood. He looked at me. Do you like jazz? I considered lying to seem more interesting. I like it when I encounter it. I don't seek it out. That's honest. He seemed satisfied. Most people either fake like jazz or fake hate it. What about you? He looked at the record. I think it sounds like being patient about something sad. A beat. Uncle James doesn't know I said that. He'd do the eyebrow thing. What's the eyebrow thing? Marcus looked at James. James raised one eyebrow. That thing, Marcus said, means he's moved. James picked up his beer. Thank you, Marcus. Very dignified. Marcus stood, took the record, went back to the wall. James watched him go. He's going through something, James said quietly. His father, Renata's husband, moved to Phoenix 8 months ago. New job, new start. Marcus was supposed to go with him for the summer. Then the summer became a school year. He stayed. He chose to stay. James's voice was careful, which was brave. But 16-year-olds aren't supposed to have to be that brave. I looked at Marcus, who was reading the back of a record he wasn't going to buy with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with his hands. You show up for him. He calls. A slight smile. Sometimes at inconvenient times. Like tonight. He held my gaze. I'm sorry, it's not what you expected. What did you expect me to expect? He thought about it. A normal first date. Reasonable questions. Nobody else's backpack. In fairness, the backpack is very small. Nora, James. I said it lightly. I'm a developmental editor. I spend my professional life with manuscripts that don't arrive in the shape they meant to arrive in. I'm not disturbed by the unexpected draft. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't catalog yet. I was trying. Then his phone lit up on the table. He glanced at it, and something in his face contracted slightly. Everything okay? It's Renata. He typed something short. She wants to know if I've mentioned the furniture yet. You did. She'll be pleased. But he hadn't quite come back from wherever the message had taken him. I noted it without pushing. She worries about you, I said. That's why she set this up. He looked up. How do you know that? Because I've worked with her for 4 years, and she doesn't do things casually. If she made this call, it's because she thought it mattered. James was quiet. The piano from the speakers filled the space. She thinks I've disappeared, he said, finally, into being needed. She doesn't say it that way, but that's what she means. A pause. She's probably not wrong. I thought about Paul, about how he'd said I was the most observant person he'd ever met, about how he'd meant it as the tenderest possible indictment. People who are good at caring for others sometimes forget to ask for things. And I said, is that you too? The question was direct, not aggressive, curious. The kind of curious that required honesty. I ask for things, I said. I just describe them so precisely that the other person gets confused and gives me something else. That surprised a laugh out of him. A real one. Sudden. That's the most specific way I've ever heard someone describe being indirect. See what I mean? He shook his head, smiling now, and the smile changed his whole face. Opened it. Nora Callahan, he said. James, I realized I didn't know his last name. Okafor, he said. James Okafor. I tried it. Did Renata tell you anything about me? She said you were funny. I said, that's not a personality. She said you were smart. I said, that's not a personality either. She said you were the only person she knew who'd reread the same novel 4 times and cried at different parts every time. A pause. She said that like it meant something. What did you think? He looked at me carefully. I thought it meant you were paying attention. I had not been planning for the evening to contain that sentence. I sat with it for a moment. Then Marcus appeared again, this time with a record I didn't recognize. I'm going to buy this, he announced. Found it in the dollar bin. It's a 1,969 Brazilian bossa nova record that someone threw away. That is a crime. Buy it, I said. He looked at me. You know bossa nova? I know that throwing away good things is a crime. He studied me for 2 full seconds. Okay, he said. Jury's coming back. He went to the bar to pay. James watched him, then looked at me with something warm and careful in his expression. He likes you, he said. He's evaluating me. There's a difference. With Marcus, it's the same thing. Near the end of the evening, the bartender put on something slow and barely there, and Marcus stretched across the table and pointed between us and said, "Are you two going to do the whole talking but not saying it thing for the rest of the night?" Or, "Marcus," James said, "Why? I've been watching for 2 hours. I have observations. Keep them fine." He settled back. "She's better than the last two." James pressed his eyes closed. "There have been 2 others?" I said, "No," James said. "Technically." Marcus said, "Marcus, I will confiscate that record. You paid for it." That is not the argument you think it is. I was laughing, and the laughing felt good in my chest, like something that had been sitting folded for a long time had been shaken out. James caught me laughing, and for a second, across the small table with the empty cans and the borrowed backpack and Miles Davis looking up at us from the vinyl, we looked at each other and neither of us looked away first. That was probably enough information. I said, "Probably, I'm glad he told me." James held my gaze. "So am I." Outside, the October air had turned mean. Marcus zipped his hoodie and said, "Why does Chicago think this is appropriate?" And James said, "It doesn't ask." Renata had texted that she'd pick Marcus up at the corner. She lived 12 minutes away and had apparently been in the grocery store parking lot for 45 minutes on standby, which I chose not to think too hard about. We stood outside while Marcus waited at the corner with his Bossa Nova record tucked under his arm. "I didn't expect this evening," James said. "Good unexpected or complicated unexpected?" He considered that with real care. "Both," he said. "You?" I looked down the street at the restaurant lights and the late night foot traffic and the November sky starting to swallow the glow of things. "I think I forgot how to want something normal," I said. "After Paul, I got very good at being fine." A pause. "Fine is very safe and extremely exhausting." James nodded slowly. "Being needed felt safer than being wanted," he said. "For a while. Did that change?" He looked at me. "I'm here, aren't I?" A car pulled up. Marcus turned. "Good night, Nora," he said. "Then jury's back. Verdict?" He got in the car. "Provisional approval." He shut the door. Through the window, I watched Renata immediately start talking. Marcus held up the record. She threw her head back, laughing. James watched them drive away. "She's going to call you," he said. "I'm going to let it go to voicemail for 20 minutes so she thinks I'm unbothered." "You're not unbothered?" I turned to face him. The streetlight was directly above us, and it gave everything a particular quality of honesty, the kind where you can see someone's face too clearly to pretend you're not seeing it. "I'm the opposite of unbothered," I said. Methodically and specifically. James laughed. Then quietly, as if he'd decided something, he said, "Can I see you again? Not we should do this again. Not I'll have Renata pass something along. Can I see you?" Like it was a request he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to make. "Yes," I said, emphatically. He smiled the same smile from inside, the one that opened his face. I decided then that I could spend a considerable amount of time trying to earn that smile and not consider it wasted. "Saturday afternoon," he said. "I'm finishing a commission in my workshop. A small cabinet, nothing dramatic. But if you wanted to watch you make furniture, to see where I go when I'm not in front of teenagers, that's the most charming way anyone has ever invited me somewhere." I meant it. He handed me his phone. I typed in my number, saved it as Nora, not unbothered. When he saw it, something in his expression did the thing, the slight openness. "Good night, James Okafor." "Good night, Nora Callahan." He turned to walk toward his car, stopped. "For the record," he said, "I was also hoping you'd be kind, not just smart." And he looked at me for one more second. "Jury's back." Then he went. I stood on the sidewalk until I couldn't see him anymore. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I opened it. Also, for the record, the wine in a can was a perfectly reasonable choice, and I won't hear otherwise. I typed back with cold fingers and a ridiculous smile. "Me? You don't have to defend my choices." "I know." I wanted to. Another message. Seconds later. "Saturday, 2 p.m. I'll send you the address." The workshop smells like sawdust and burned coffee. Fair warning. Those are my two favorite smells. That can't possibly be true. There's only one way to find out. He sent back a single period. I stood there on the sidewalk deciding that a single period was the most deliberate form of punctuation I'd ever received, which was an embarrassing thought and also entirely true. My phone buzzed again. Renata. So I let it ring twice, then answered. Nora, she said, not even a hello. Tell me everything. I looked at the door of Second Spin, at the amber light in the window, at the small handwritten card still visible beside the Joni Mitchell record. Still the best. Your brother, I said, is very much not what I expected. She screamed, briefly, into the phone. It was the most unprofessional sound I had ever heard her make, and it was wonderful. Saturday afternoon, James's workshop was in the garage of a small house in Bridgeport. He had left the door up and I could hear a sander running before I even knocked. He turned when I appeared in the doorway, goggles pushed up on his forehead, sawdust on his forearms, and the focused expression of a man who had been trying to solve a problem and had just been interrupted. Then his face changed. Not dramatically, just opened. You came, he said. You invited me. I know. He took the goggles off. I'm glad. The workshop was precise and warm. Pegboards with tools labeled in neat tape. A shelf of small pieces, trial cuts, test joints arranged by size. The way a person who thinks carefully about space lives. In the center was the cabinet. Pale oak, clean lines, the kind of furniture that would outlast the person who commissioned it. He gave me a stool and a cup of burned coffee and went back to work. We talked while he sanded about his students, a junior who kept trying to memorize chemistry without understanding it, a sophomore who understood all of it and couldn't explain a single thing, about my manuscript, which had entered the phase where the author was emailing passive-aggressive questions phrased as clarifications, about Marcus, who had apparently played the bossa nova record on repeat until Renata said it was either beautiful or haunting. She couldn't decide. He's been better this week, James said, since Thursday. Thursday helped. Something did. He looked at me. He said you were honest with him, that you didn't talk to him like he was an inconvenience. I thought about that. He wasn't. Some people find teenagers difficult. Some teenagers easy. James was quiet for a moment. The sander moved in long, steady strokes. His father called, he said finally. Last week. Asked Marcus to come for Thanksgiving. Marcus said he'd think about it. A pause, which is different from last month, when he said no immediately. Progress looks small, but it counts. I watched him work. His hands were careful with the wood, not careful like someone afraid of mistakes, careful like someone who understood what a thing was worth. Can I ask you something? I said, yes. Do you always pour that much of yourself into other people's problems? He kept sanding. Probably. Does it cost you something? He stopped, set the sander down, looked at me with the directness I was starting to recognize as his most characteristic feature. I don't know what I'd do with the space, he said. If I stopped, what do you mean? He leaned against the workbench. I've been responsible for things since I was 19. My mother got sick. Renata was 15. My dad was there, but he chose the word carefully, not all the way there. So I learned to organize myself around what was needed. A pause. I'm good at it. But I think I got so good at it that I stopped knowing how to want things that weren't needed from me. He said it without drama. It was just true. And he was saying it because I had asked. I do that too, I said. Differently. I describe things instead of wanting them. It's a kind of distance I wear. We're a pair, he said. Not bitterly. Maybe. I looked at the cabinet. What do you want? Right now. He thought about it with real care. To finish this cabinet well. A pause. To know you better. Another. To figure out, at some point, how to leave work at work instead of carrying it home in my body. He looked at me. What about you? I had not answered that question directly in approximately 2 years. I sat with it. To stop narrating my own life from a safe distance, I said. To be in it. He nodded. Like that was enough. Like it didn't need to be fixed. We worked in companionable quiet after that, him sanding, me reading a manuscript printout I'd brought because I'd mentioned it half apologetically and he'd said, bring it. I liked the idea of us both working, which had lodged in me like a small, warm weight. At some point, I looked up and found him looking at me. What? I said. Nothing. A pause. You have a pencil behind your ear. I always have a pencil behind my ear. I noticed, and he stepped closer. It was a small workshop, 3 steps, and he was beside my stool. He reached up, not toward me, beside me, to adjust a clamp on the shelf above my head. His arm passed close to my shoulder. You annotate in the margins, he said. Always. So do I. When I read, he stepped back but didn't go far. I meant to mention it Thursday. You held your phone a certain way, and I could see the corners of your e-reader. You noticed my e-reader. I noticed things. I thought I was the observer in this scenario. You were observing the record shop. He tilted his head slightly. I was observing you. There are sentences a person hears with their whole body. James, I said. Yes. Is this you being patient or is this you actually doing something? He looked at me for a beat. Then he leaned down and kissed me very quietly, one hand resting at the edge of the workbench beside me, close but not touching, like he was giving me the full choice. His mouth was warm, the sawdust smell was everywhere, and outside a bus ground past on Halstead Street, and none of it mattered at all. When he drew back, his expression was measured and his eyes were not. Both, he said. Both? Patient and actually doing something. I laughed. He looked pleased with himself in a way he was clearly trying to contain. That was my favorite answer. I said, we didn't become a simple thing overnight. Nothing with James was simple in the best possible way. He had Marcus every other weekend and Thursday evenings, and sometimes in between when Renata needed him, and I had manuscripts with urgent timelines and a tendency to go quiet in ways that needed to be named before they became walls. We learned to name them. 6 weeks in, he called on a Tuesday and said, you've been politely distant for 4 days. I'm not reading into it, but I wanted to mention it. I sat with that for a moment, then said, I got scared about how much I like this. He said, I know. Me too. Can we just say that next time? I said, I'm working on saying things directly. He said, so am I. We made it a practice. 3 months in, Marcus came over for dinner, which I cooked badly, and James rescued without comment. And at the end of the evening, Marcus said, are you two going to figure out the living situation thing, or should I stop leaving stuff at both places? James said, Marcus. Marcus said, I'm just trying to reduce logistical complexity. Uncle James, she annotates physical books with a pencil. You should see this. It's unnerving and impressive. James looked at me across the kitchen. It's not unnerving, he said. Marcus shrugged. 8 stars out of, we'll see. 5 months in, James brought me something. He arrived at my apartment on a Saturday morning with a small shelf, the exact right width for the narrow wall beside my front door where I'd been stacking mail and keys and 3 library books since moving in. I'd mentioned it exactly once, in passing 4 months prior. He had made it from white oak, clean joints. The precise depth I would have specified if I'd ever gotten around to specifying it. I stood in the doorway, looking at it for a long moment. You remembered, I said. You mentioned it, he said. You mentioned it once and then didn't ask again, and I thought, he paused. I thought, she wants this. And she stopped asking because she stopped expecting a beat. So I made it. I looked at the shelf. Then at him, James Okafor, Nora Callahan. This is the most romantic thing that has ever happened to me involving carpentry. He laughed, the sudden, delighted kind. Then I stepped forward and kissed him in the doorway of my apartment with his hand still holding the shelf between us. And he managed to set it down eventually, carefully, against the wall. And then his hands were free. The shelf stayed. He stayed. That evening, I hung my keys on it and set my library books on the bottom row, and we made dinner, and afterward I sat on the kitchen counter while he washed the dishes because he washed dishes the way he built things, with patience and attention. And I thought about the word Paul had used, efficient. I had called myself efficient. for 2 years. Effective. Fine. I looked at James, sleeves rolled up, talking about a student who had finally, after 6 weeks, understood the concept of entropy. And I thought, this is not efficient. This is the opposite of efficient. This takes everything. And I had not once wanted to describe it from a safe distance. 7 months in, I told him I loved him on a Wednesday morning before he left for school. Not dramatically. He was putting on his coat and I was reading the first 20 pages of a new manuscript. And I looked up and said, James, I love you. The way you say something you've known for a while, but are finally ready to say out loud. He stopped with his coat half on. He turned around. Say it again. I love you. He came back across the apartment and kissed me once, very deliberately, the way you do something you've been waiting to do carefully. I love you, Nora. He said it against my hair. I've been not saying it for 6 weeks because I didn't want to push. You can push sometimes. I know. He pulled back. I'm working on it. So am I said, saying things directly. His eyes were warm. We're getting better. We are. From my phone, a text from Marcus. Uncle James, did you leave my basketball stuff at Nora's again? Then a second later, also, hi, Nora. Hi, Marcus. I typed back. James was reading over my shoulder. He knows I'm here. He always knows. Is that okay? I looked up at him. It's my favorite thing. I said, 1 year after the first night, we went back to second spin. The three of us, Marcus had asked to come, which felt like something. He was taller now, 17, less hooded, more present. He went immediately to the dollar bin. James and I stood at the bar. Same bartender, same bracket, fungus tattoo, same low amber light. Blue was still in the window. The handwritten card had been replaced, same handwriting, same sentiment. Still the best. James ordered beer. I ordered the canned rosé, because some commitments are worth keeping. I was nervous that night, he said, more than I showed. You didn't show any. I practiced the not showing. He turned his glass. I almost didn't come. Renata had to call me twice from the parking lot. She was in the parking lot. She drove past 3 times to make sure I went in. He smiled. She's not subtle. I thought about myself at 6:58, standing in the doorway, organizing observations into categories. I almost left after 10 minutes. I said, you don't know that. You catalog things, he said. You wouldn't have left a question uncatalogued. I looked at him. That's a very accurate thing to say. I've been paying attention. I know, I said. So have I. From across the shop, Marcus appeared holding a record. Found another one, he said. How 1,972. I'm buying it. Use your own money, James said. I am. Obviously. He paused, looking between us. Are you two doing the talking but not saying it thing again? No, I said. We've been saying it. He studied us. And good. He went back to the bin. James's hand found mine on the bar. Just quietly. Fingers threading together, the way they had learned to. I looked at the Joni Mitchell record in the window. Still the best, I said. He squeezed my hand. I think so too. Outside later, the three of us walked to James's car in the cold. Marcus had 2 records now and held them like evidence. The city moved around us the way cities do, indifferent and loud, full of people doing their ordinary, extraordinary things. At the car, Marcus stopped and looked at me with a considered expression. Final review, he said, I'm ready. 9 stars out of 10. The missing one is for the wine in a can. He got in the back seat. James looked at me over the roof of the car. The streetlight caught his eyes. 9 out of 10, he said. Sounds about right. I thought it was full marks. He's principled. He doesn't give 10s. I thought about Thursday night, 14 months ago, standing alone in a record shop with a canned rosé and a well-organized anxiety. The way I had almost cataloged the whole evening into manageable distance and missed it entirely. I looked at James Okafor, who had walked in carrying someone else's backpack and an expression that mixed relief and embarrassment and humor, who noticed e-reader annotations and remembered offhand mentions of hallway shelves, who was patient and also, when it counted, actually doing something. James, I said. Yes, Thank you for being in the parking lot. He smiled then, the one that opened his face all the way. Thank you for not leaving. We got in the car. Marcus put on the Bossa Nova record because he digitized it, and Renata had once called it hauntingly beautiful from the other room, which he found deeply gratifying. James pulled out of the parking space. I looked out the window at the city. For the first time in a long time, I was not observing my own life from the outside in. I was simply in it.
Have you ever had a first date arrive sideways, a wrong turn that somehow became the right one? Tell me your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe.
I'll see you in the next one.